In 1903, 4 climbers set out in the early morning to attempt to climb up the highest peak in England by a route that had never been attempted before. Or as they put it, they were going to try new things. As the sunny, warm weather turned cold and rainy, the 4 climbers did become the first climbers to accomplish a feat on that mountain. But it was not the one they were planning for. This is the pinnacle. On the evening of September 21st, 1903 at 5:20 p.m., a man rushed into the main hall of Ritson's Hotel at Risdale Head, England. The man was soaking wet, exhausted, and out of breath. As he took a moment to catch his breath, everyone that was in the hall gathered around to see what the commotion was all about. The man then said that he needed anyone that had experience in mountain climbing. He also needed any able-bodied doctors to come with him up Scafell Pike. He and 2 members of his mountain climbing group had discovered 4 bodies on the rocks below the pinnacle, and at least one of them was still alive. The innkeeper immediately picked up the telephone and dialed up any nearby doctors and climbers that had telephones at the time. They all rushed to the hotel and gathered in the main hall and made a plan. After about an hour and a half, they had gathered enough men, climbing equipment, and medical equipment to head off up the mountain. It was 7 o'clock at night when the rescue party left the hotel into the darkness to scale the north face of Scafell Crag in wet conditions. The men held lanterns to light their way up the north face, which is broadly considered the most difficult and treacherous route. It was also dark, cold, and wet, which would make this rescue attempt extremely dangerous. As the group ascended the north face, the wet conditions made progress agonizingly slow. At points that should be fairly simple, the group found themselves on their hands and knees, crawling on soft ground, through mud, and across slick rocks. At points, their ascent would grind to a halt, as men in front would have to help slower men in the back. Even with the slow progress, the men pushed forward and made decent time, arriving at approximately 8:30 p.m. To their surprise, the first man that they came to was conscious and insisted on telling the rescue team his story. No one had asked. The group was only concerned with saving him and finding the other 3 men that were strewn about on the rocks. But this man insisted on relaying his story. This is what happened. On the morning of September 21st, 2 groups of climbers departed Risdale Head for a day of climbing the various crags of Scafell. The first group included the 4 men, Richard Broderick, Henry Jupe, Stanley Risdale, and Algernon Garrett. 3 of the 4 men from the first group were from the south of England and stayed at the Wastwater Hotel, now known as the Risdale Head Inn. The hotel staff would later describe these 3 men, Henry Jupe, Stanley Risdale, and Algernon Garrett, as well-to-do middle to upper-class men from the south that were 3 of the nicest men that one could ever meet. The 4th man of the group, Richard Broderick, was a local. He was from Highfell, Windermere. All 4 men were experienced climbers that were not only prepared to tackle Scafell, they were also prepared to, as they called it, try new things. The second group included 3 men known by their last names of Webb, Slade, and Williamson. The morning of September 21st was sunny, and the members of the 2 groups were excited to tackle the mountain. They headed out early to spend the entire day climbing the north face of the mountain. Scafell Pike is the highest summit in England. It sits in the Lake District, Cumbria, and is an inactive volcano and part of the Scafell Massif. The summit is 3,209 feet, or 978 meters, with a prominence of 2,992 feet, or 912 meters, with prominence being the elevation change from the base of the mountain to the peak. Scafell Pike, along with nearby Scafell, are tourist attractions with many routes leading to the summits of the 2 peaks. The summits can be reached by difficult hikes or by difficult climbs, depending on the route that one takes. However, in 1903, there were only a few routes to the top. Many of the difficult climbing routes of today had not yet been explored, and the 4 men in 1903 attempted a climb that no one had attempted before. And only one man, the famous Owen Glenn Jones, had completed a similar climb up the pinnacle. The first group of climbers ascended Deep Gill and climbed directly to the summit of Scafell from the Deep Gill's second pitch. The second group spent the morning hours on the north face. Before they had left that morning and parted ways, the 2 groups had agreed to meet and have lunch together in the early afternoon. The 2 groups came together and rested and exchanged stories from the morning on Rake's progress. After a short break, the groups were re-energized and ready for more exploring that afternoon. Around 2:30 p.m., the groups again went their own ways. The group of 4 headed toward Lord's Rake, but only after borrowing 60 feet of rope from the other group. These men were heading to a location to attempt a climb that no one had completed before, as they put it, try new things. Ascent of the pinnacle direct from Lord's Rake. In 1898, Owen Glenn Jones and G.T. Walker summited the pinnacle within the angle formed by 2 lines drawn from the top of Lowman, one to the bottom of the buttress and the other to the bottom of Hopkins Gully. Jones later wrote that they were only able to just overcome the difficulty of the climb because the conditions were perfect. In fact, 11 years earlier, C. Hopkinson of Hopkinson's Gully and 3 others had attempted the climb, but had to turn back when the weather turned. At about 200 feet up the face, they were stopped by a steep slab of ice-coated rock. Jones also wrote that ascent by the buttress was thrilling and possible, but many extremely experienced climbers have stated that at the time, with the equipment that they had, it was impossible. This is where the group of 4 men were headed, and the nice clear weather that they had had all morning was about to change. While the 4 men were attempting new feats, the group of 3 did the Keswick Brothers climb and then returned to Rake's Progress to retrieve a rucksack that they had left from the lunch meeting that they had had with the other group earlier that day. As they continued their day, the weather became worse and worse, turning from sunshine to cloudy and from slight drizzle to rain. The group of 3 decided to continue along Rake's Progress to Lord's Rake and end their day descending the scree just below the rake. However, when they reached Lord's Rake, they found 4 men tied together laying on the rocks some ways down the scree. Williamson immediately headed down the mountain to get help. Webb and Slade converged on Risdale. He was still conscious, but terribly mangled and entangled in the rope. Webb and Slade began checking Risdale when Risdale stopped them and said, "I have broken both of my legs and my back. Go and look after the other chaps." However, Henry Jupe, Algernon Garrett, and the local man, Richard Broderick, were all dead. It was 5:40 p.m. when Williamson began his descent to find help. The rescue party arrived to find Risdale still conscious. The rescuers were wet and cold and carrying medical equipment and a stretcher for Risdale. After providing much-needed aid and securing his broken body to the stretcher, it was 11 o'clock before they began their descent. As they made their way slowly down the face of the mountain, along the soft ground and soaked rocks, Risdale slipped in and out of consciousness. On the way down, the lanterns went out, and they were left feeling their way around the rocks in the darkness towards Lingmel. Their pathways were slick rocks and loose stones as they carried a half-dead man on a stretcher, whose only relief from the pain was an occasional shot of brandy. The rescue team crossed a gushing stream twice and traversed a channel in the rocks to avoid a long detour. When they reached Westwater Hotel at 3:30 a.m., Risdale had succumbed to his injuries. They placed his mangled body in the hotel hall and collapsed from exhaustion. The next day, 15 men retrieved the bodies of Jupe, Garrett, and Broderick. Climbers have since located nails and markings where it is believed that the men had ascended the buttress. The markings end just below a crack in the face, 200 feet above where they were found on the scree. Given the heavy ropes tied around their waist and the hobnail boots as their only climbing equipment, it was quite a feat just to make it that far, and in the wet, slippery conditions, it was impossible. It is believed that the ascent began with the local man that knew the mountain, Richard Broderick, leading the team for a short while, but as Broderick became exhausted, Risdale took over. In hindsight, this may have been the time when they should have turned back. However, they were all experienced and determined climbers and carried on. If any of the 3 behind Risdale had slipped, they most likely could have recovered, with the others anchoring their fall. However, that was not the case. Risdale, from his position, highest up leading the group, slipped and brought down the entire group. These 4 men were the first to die climbing the highest peak in England. The extent of this tragedy would not be surpassed for more than 50 years until an accident occurred on Ben Nevis in 1953. In a commemorative speech given 100 years later in 2003, mountaineer Guy Newbold said, "If you look at what they did, how they did it, and the technique and equipment they were using, you realize how well they were climbing. If a route grade is severe now with all the modern equipment, what was it then on a rainy, blustery day with the bare essentials? It was phenomenal. There was no margin for error. This is True Mysteries. Please like, leave comments, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.